The following content has been provided by RWTH Aachen University.
So how can we limit those prototypes? You don't want to implement everything. You don't want to even present everything in the final interface or in your prototype interface that is in the final system. So one way to limit is, and this is the one that you do a lot, is the horizontal way, where you basically say, I'm showing you the user interface. This is the sort of the users looking at the interface here, and those are the depths of the system, the back end, the databases, and the system architecture. So you show them the UI, the surface of the system, basically, but there isn't really any functionality behind it. So every step that you do is simulated. When I was talking about the database application, the phone book application, there aren't really any user records in the phone book. It's just basically screenshots, for example, and just standard static text and boxes. The other way to go is to go vertical. Say I want to do a phone book app. I could actually implement the browsing through the phone book with lots of information and lots of people in there, but there is no way to actually, I don't know, edit a user record or to delete a user or to add a user. I just provide the basic browsing functionality. So I can also limit vertically and just have particular parts of the system available. Does that make sense? Horizontal, just UI, no functionality. Vertical means just focusing on a particular aspect. For example, just printing in a software, or just parts of it. And you might end up having a combination of both, saying like, I'm going to go only horizontal, but only in a particular area of the software. And that is sort of, sometimes we call this a scenario, where you basically provide a very precise fixed interaction path through your software. What that means is I have a mock-up of the interface, and I only have one way of stepping through that interface. I only have one way of interacting with it, which is basically the prototype tells me which buttons the user is going to press at each step. So I don't have a choice. I just have to click through, basically, and say, OK, if you do this, then this happens. If you want to get a little more fancy, then you can do screenshot prototypes. And those are usually done using Photoshop or PowerPoint. I'll show you a couple examples in a second. You draw your screens or your UI storyboards. It's a very thin horizontal prototype because there isn't any code running behind it. It's just screenshots. It's just pictures, JPEGs. And the big advantage of them is they are easier to change and to manipulate and also to distribute to other people than a paper prototype. You can also make them look nicer. So if you are at that stage where you think you've worked out the major issues with your interface, with paper prototypes, you can now move to software prototypes, do screenshots, and show people some of the visual design aesthetics that your system is going to have, so you can get feedback about that. If you're lucky, and let's say you've got a graphic artist in your team, and that graphic artist is making the designs for your prototype, then you might be able to actually use some of that graphic artwork later in your real system for the icons, for example. Right? I had an example where we designed a system, and we had a graphic artist, and he basically drew the sketches of the interface in Photoshop and made them really nice, and we used some of that artwork for the final system. So that's definitely a possibility. Especially useful when you have non-standard GUIs where you don't just use normal boxes and dialog boxes and buttons and menus, because, I mean, if you just use standard components, then there isn't much visual aesthetic design to do. Easy electronic distribution, I mentioned that already. You got a software prototype, you can send it around. Some of the problems with screenshot prototypes are that a screenshot prototype is really just a sequence of screenshots. So you step through, there is no interaction beyond going to the next screen. Right? So you have to basically, each screen has to say, and now we imagine that the user presses this thing or does this, and then we go to the next screen. So it's one fixed sequence. There is the danger, especially if you have dynamic things going on. For example, let's say there is well, let's say there's some animation in your interface. People are dragging things around on the screen. That's kind of hard to simulate. You could do a little animation in your PowerPoint slideshow and show an animated movement. That's a way to address some of that. But as soon as you get into trickier things, like doodling, for example, in a graphic application, that gets really hard to simulate. There's also the danger of the system looking too polished, which might limit your feedback, as we said before, to visual details rather than the big picture. And it might suggest the interface is done. We're also missing the physical aspect of devices, so we don't really have a feel for example, the phone in our hand or the tablet in our hand if we just do a plain screenshot prototype. For that, we have other techniques, for example, hardware prototyping, which I'll get to later. So the first simplest way of doing software prototypes is an on-screen storyboard. So it's like the storyboard that we talked about, the comic book storyboard, but it's a scripted simulation. You use media tools like Photoshop or PowerPoint and create basically a sequence of pictures of your snapshots of your UI. If you want to get a little more interactive, you can use scene transitions with simple input. For example, in PowerPoint, you can define what they call buttons. And if somebody clicks on something at a particular area on the PowerPoint slide, it goes to a particular other slide. Same thing in Keynote. So those are simple ways to have a UI sort of simulated. You could use timing, so you can have something happen after a certain time. That's, again, something that animation tools in PowerPoint, for example, give you. Or use animation to move things across the screen. So we'll see some of those examples later. This is a prototype that has a bit more vertical depth than, once you start building things like clickable regions into your layout. That is more interactive than just going through picture 1, picture 2, picture 3. A couple of ways you can use this. You could say, give it to the user, and they get a little bit of instructions to it and say, and go through the prototype themselves so they see what it feels like to interact with the system. Or you could use it for pitching, showing it to one or more users or to your team, and basically telling them, this is how I imagine the interface to work. It looks real. It's a good way to do it, especially for non-standard user interfaces. And you don't need to do any programming. Why for non-standard user interfaces? Well, because you can, in PowerPoint or graphics application or Photoshop, you can draw any interface you want. You're not tied down to the toolbox of interface components that you get from your interface builder in your favorite development environment. And you don't need to do any programming. Nothing fancy is going on there. The problem, of course, with those things is that they are a simulation. So as soon as the user wants to do something else, then what you offer in the simulation, then the prototype fails. Right? It can't do anything else. So it has to kind of follow the script that you provided. We're going to look at a couple examples of that. The first one is a storyboard that is done very much like a final application. It looks very finished. It uses actual screenshots from real buttons. And it's supposed to show an in-store shopping app. The idea is this is sort of an application that you use inside a store where you're going through the shelves and you see something you like a Toys R Us, for example. You see something that you want to buy for your kid, and then you say, I would like to have this thing, and then you scan the item. It has a barcode next to the shelf where this thing is shown. And all the things you scan, that's the idea of this prototype, would then be sort of automatically collected for you at the cash desk so you can check out. You don't need to carry all these things through the store. Somebody packages all the things that you just selected up for you, and you pick them up at the exit. That's the idea behind this, and we're going to see a little prototype of how that might work. And pay attention to what kind of techniques, animation techniques, those kinds of things were used in order to simulate the interface. Good. So here's the first screen. What you see here in this area is the simulated interface. Okay. What's outside this area on the rest of the page, here is what we should imagine in the world, right? What's out there next to the interface when the system would be really used. So imagine you're walking, I'm now going to talk you through the system. Imagine the user walking through the store, you're walking through the store, and you see this stroller in a shelf, and it has a little barcode next to it. And the system itself, the app, shows sort of this, hey, find the item you want in the catalog and scan the barcode next to it. So you find this item, and nothing is currently entered, right? That's the interface. Nothing is going on currently. So you now scan an item. There we go. Here's the hand with the scanner scanning the item. And once that happens, we then get results, OK? So now we scrolled some kind of stroller in a particular style. It costs a certain amount of money. And it's also selected up here in a particular color. Okay, and here's your sort of your list of things that you're shopping. Next thing you go ahead to do is, oh, I don't like this color maybe. So let me change the color. So you move in with your finger, and you click on the blue item, and you now have, sorry, I was going too fast. You now have a blue selected instead of green. And that should hopefully then also at some point update down here. That didn't happen yet, so we already see an issue in the system. Oh, we need to remember to keep those two things in sync. Moving on, let's say the user then places an order, taps on the place your order thing. What happens then is that the thing creates a printout that you pick up, and you bring those printouts to the front counter at the exit of the store, where you then can pick up all your items and pay for them. So this was a very simple interaction. You can see some of the uses of animation, of using animated parts, transitions in an application here in order to move from A to B. Let's look at another one. A couple of years ago, since I also have the honorful role of being responsible for some of the public appearance of the computer science department to the outside world. A couple of years ago, I was asked to propose a new design for the website of our department, of the CS department. So I went ahead and did a sort of screenshot prototype of the website to show it to everybody in the faculty and get their feedback before we went ahead and actually built the thing. And so here's this prototype that I built. You can see here, I used Keynote to do this, and this is actually now, we're now looking at Keynote prototype for real. This is just a Keynote prototype pasted into this presentation. And so it's showing the various buttons and sort of areas on the website that I was imagining. And it uses links inside Keynote to jump to other slides. So it's no longer like the one before, no longer just a sequential presentation. This can actually now branch to different areas and go back and forth. The main navigation bar up here, this is actually clickable regions. And the second level navigation bar is also clickable, but only under this first subtype. I didn't do all of them. I just did one. So that's a typical example of limiting your prototype, right? I didn't detail out all these things into fully interactive submenus, just the first one. So let's use this, and let's say we click on the area with the Studium here. We would then get to this submenu would then appear, and it would give you some more selections here. The current selection is highlighted in this way. That was a design decision, and it would then, under current stuff happening, it would give you some kinds of events list that's going on. But we could also then tab over and say, like, why study at RWTH Aachen? Oh, there's so many reasons, and we list them here. You can tab through and look at the various programs that you can study. You can look at the list of people to talk to. You got some service links, like to the library, to the computing services, etc. And you can find out particular things for people who finished their studies and want to stay connected to the group. OK, so that's one example. And then similar first level things were also here under research and under talking to the folks in industry, and about the computer science department itself, like the list of faculty that we have, what professors are there, and so on. Okay, so that was an example. And like I said, I could also use this in Keynote and actually sort of move between things at will. I could jump from one to the other. These are active buttons in the presentation. So a nice way to do a sort of interactive prototype. And you'll notice I used fonts and lines that try to still suggest a hand-drawn look, even though this was done by computer, to give it that sort of preliminary rough feel. So people wouldn't get hung up on, oh, but we should use the color, orange here, and would just basically look at the very fundamental design. Here's another example. The personal orchestra system that we built in Vienna for where you can conduct an orchestra needed a prototype as well to tell people how it would work. And we needed to pitch that to the museum for whom we designed this. And we did this by using Photoshop layers to simulate interacting with the system. We basically created one Photoshop document that had all the different user interface states in there. And that was, as you will see in a minute, made a lot of sense for this particular interface because there were only small things changing. So highlighting menu options that you were pointing to or moving to different screens was all on different layers of that Photoshop element. Photoshop layers are a pretty powerful thing. They can do some magic, especially, I'm sure you've all used layers in a graphical application like Photoshop, but Photoshop also, for example, lets you combine layers, mark them, and say, if I click on this button, I want layers 1, 3, and 7 to become visible and all the others invisible. So you can sort of set certain combinations of layers that appear or disappear in one go. And that's very useful when you want to do something like this. Also, I should say that normally your screenshot prototype will look less polished than what you'll see here, because this was actually using those graphics from the graphics artist that I mentioned that we then also used for the final prototype, for the final system. So this was actually, in the end, ended up being the final visual design. So let me show you a short video of how you would use this thing in Photoshop. So here, I think we need to click this one more time. There we go. So we're now going to see the Photoshop. Here we are in Photoshop, and we're going to look at the layers menu. So you can see the various layers selectable here. And how the system works, we should explain, is it has a couple of basic graphics in there, like the title and the various pieces that the user can select from, Radetzky March, Blue Danube, and so on. And each of those has these various highlights here. Now, what I'm currently creating is a state that the user would never see because everything is currently highlighted, right? But if I select just the right things, like, for example, now Radetzky March or now Blue Danube, one at a time, we see it looks as if the user was selecting one piece or another. And this can be done nicely with layer comps, as it's called in Photoshop. The initial state is this, highlighting Radetzky or Blue Danube or a little night music is done by simply clicking on a single button. So you can see I can drive this interface by selecting these layer compositions up here in this menu, or even step through them with these arrows. That's a perfect way to show one option of, or one combination of layers after the other. And it looks like I'm actually navigating through these various menus there. So fairly complex Photoshop thing that we built there. And, but it worked great because it showed users exactly, the museum exactly what it would feel like to navigate through this screen, select something, and would give you an idea of what the interface would be about. This also included going to other screens where we would then replace the entire screen with different information. But for example, the background graphic here was always kept in place and always looked the same. So that was a Photoshop layer that was always visible in all the compositions.
This content was provided by RWTH Aachen University.